the worst nightmare about our experience in Vietnam is in fact a reality. We left our men behind. We deserted men, and we left them to languish as POWs. But for the fact these men were Asian, it wouldn't have happened. The CIA would never have done this to white Yale graduates. Would never have left them behind.
Former CIA Director William Colby disappeared last weekend, apparently while canoeing in Maryland. Over the years, we've often gone to Bill Colby for his expertise. In an interview just 4 weeks ago, he confirmed for us details of a disastrous covert operation he had launched in Vietnam back in 1961. We call this report the Lost Commandos. To begin, it is hard to believe that American officers in Vietnam would abandon their men, but that is exactly what happened. The men were South Vietnamese commandos whom the CIA and the U.S. military had recruited, trained, paid, and sent parachuting down into North Vietnam during the 1960s. Every one of those commandos, hundreds of them, while employed by the U.S., were either killed or captured. But beyond that, their American superiors wrote off the commandos who were still in prison in North Vietnam. The U.S. never negotiated for their release. When Bill Colby was CIA station chief in Saigon, he helped create the program to send the commandos into the North. What were they supposed to do up there?
Get in touch with people in their home communities or other communities and establish some networks and see whether we could look forward to resupplying them with some weapons, conduct some guerrilla operations in the long term.
Any sabotage?
Yeah, sure.
Blowing bridges?
Of course, all that sort of thing.
Yeah. And they didn't blow a bridge?
Not that I know of.
Didn't give you any intelligence?
Not particularly, no.
So it was a failure from the get-go, basically.
Yeah, didn't work.
So these people were going up there and either being killed or captured.
Mm-hmm.
Two of the men who were captured are Dinh Van Lam and Nguyen Van Hu. The CIA hired them, trained them, paid them, and parachuted them down into North Vietnam. This is confirmed in a once classified report on the commando program compiled for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Soon after Lam and Hu landed in the North, they were put in prison, where they faced malnutrition, hard labor, and worse.
Often, we were put into solitary confinement, and our legs were shackled. Because of the shackles, our legs would become dislocated and paralyzed. The rats were this big, but when they bit into our legs, we could not even feel it, because our legs were so numb.
They were not alone. Hundreds of commandos were captured, because even though the program was not working, America kept sending them in. For the men who were sent up, did they know that nobody had ever produced anything?
I doubt it.
So these guys were just going up ostensibly.
They were heroic fellows who volunteered for a very dangerous mission, and they knew it.
They knew it was dangerous. They didn't know it was hopeless.
We have done something so horrible that is a stain on all of those who served.
Sedgwick Turreson went to Vietnam almost 30 years ago as an interrogator with Army intelligence. Since then, he has worked on POW and MIA issues for the Defense Intelligence Agency and for a Senate Select Committee. And now he has made it his mission to dig up once classified information on the Lost Commandos. While researching his book, Secret Army, Secret War, Turreson discovered that North Vietnam had spies inside the commando operation, so the North knew when the commandos were coming.
The first armed team landed in North Vietnam in May of 1961.
Mm-hmm.
And as the team commander said to me, they were waiting for us. And they told us after we had been captured, they'd been waiting for us for 2 weeks.
Did the U.S. know that these teams that had parachuted down were being captured?
Yes.
The U.S. knew that Lam and Hu were caught because Radio Hanoi reported they were picked up by local militia. In fact, the North Vietnamese captured every team the CIA dropped. But the CIA kept on parachuting them in for more than 2 years.
CIA tried so hard to make it work in the summer of 1963 that nearly 50 agents in 72 hours parachuted all over the place to try and get something going to keep Washington happy. And they were all captured.
After that, and after he had lost more than 150 commandos, Colby said he finally had to acknowledge this was not going to work.
My deputy came to me and said, look, we're not getting anywhere with this. It's a waste. It's not working. So let's stop. And I said, I agree.
But Colby was not able to stop the program. Instead, he said Defense Secretary Robert McNamara had the CIA turn the commando operation over to the military, even though Colby said he warned McNamara against it.
I said, Mr. Secretary, it isn't going to work. We've tried it. I don't think it'll work. He just looked and didn't answer. And obviously the program went on.
1 month later, Robert McNamara went to President Johnson and said, in effect, that this operation was going to succeed. It was going to do what CIA couldn't do.
Colby said McNamara thought the military could do it bigger and better, that if they just dropped enough commandos into North Vietnam, some good would come of it. But dropping in more men simply meant that more men were lost. McNamara, who gave countless interviews while promoting his recent book on the war, preferred not to talk to us about the lost commandos.
They're captured, they're imprisoned, or they're shot. Why keep sending them?
It became a plan that just kept going, and no one had the courage to say, it isn't working, let's shut it down.
The commando program lasted for 7 years. The U.S. had promised the commandos that while they were away, their paychecks would keep going to their families. But after a while, so many relatives were getting paid that it became a bookkeeping bother. So the military came up with a grisly solution. They told the families the commandos were dead. According to the report for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we reduced the number gradually by declaring so many of them dead each month until we had written them all off and removed them from the monthly payrolls.
Of course, we knew they were alive.
So it was just to keep from having to pay
That's correct.
these men who had worked for us and been captured for us?
At the same time, we were bringing new agents into the program, telling them, don't worry, if you go to North Vietnam, we will continue your pay and allowances to your family.
But Dinh Van Lam's wife says that she received her husband's salary for only 3 months, and then a stranger brought heartbreaking news and a modest death payment, about $500.
I cried out loud and asked him how long my husband had been dead. But then he started to run away and did not answer me at all.
And how many years went by before you realized that you were not a widow?
16 years.
John Mattis is an attorney representing the commandos.
I think there was a firm belief that these men would all die in the prisoner of war camps, and that the dead men would tell no tales, and that this would all be swept under the rug.
And it gets worse. When the American POWs were released in 1973, the commandos thought they would get out too. But Henry Kissinger, who negotiated for the Americans, told us he was never informed about the commandos, so naturally he never asked for their release. American POWs came home. America's Vietnamese commandos stayed in prison.
Shouldn't somebody at CIA have said something?
I presume so, but I think that, and I would say yes, flatly. But I think at the time, by that time, by 1973, I think the CIA's connections with these operations was 10 years ago.
The worst nightmare about our experience in Vietnam is, in fact, a reality. We left our men behind. We deserted men, and we left them to languish as POWs.
There's been so much talk about POW MIAs, but only about American young men. But these people, you say, were working for
the United States. But for the fact these men were Asian, it wouldn't have happened. The CIA would never have done this to white Yale graduates. Would never have left them behind.
The U.S. passed up another chance to help the commandos in 1981. Commando Vu Duc Nguyen escaped from prison, and eventually he made it all the way to Chicago, where he had an attorney write to Secretary of State Alexander Haig. He told Haig that more than 300 of America's commandos were still in prison, and he asked Haig to help get them out. One of Haig's assistants wrote back that if there was a problem with prisoners, Inquiries on the matter should be addressed to the appropriate authorities in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Haig told us he does not remember the letter. By the time Hanoi finally freed the commandos, some of them had remained in prison for 15 years after the American POWs had come home. When Tin Van Lam returned to his family, his children did not believe that it was he.
My wife said, "This is your father." And she produced a picture of me, this one. She handed it to them to gradually identify me. My son rubbed my face, then patted my shoulder, and then he embraced his father.
Vietnamese who worked for the American government were supposed to be eligible to come to the United States after the war. And some commandos have come. But for years, many of them were rejected by the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS.
INS was turning them down time after time after time.
To come from Vietnam here?
That's correct. Telling them, after they had languished for 20 years in a prison camp, no, your story of involvement with the CIA is too incredible, and they would stamp their forms, not credible. No credible proof of prior association with the United States.
That finally changed last year when the U.S. ambassador to Thailand sent a long cable urging the INS to accept the commandos. After that, the INS issued travel documents to many of them and is in the process of issuing more. But the commandos remind the CIA and the Pentagon that there is still a debt to be paid. American POWs were paid for the time they languished in prison, and now more than 200 commandos have filed suit against the United States asking for back pay, $2,000 a year for each year they spent in prison.
Not interest, not pain and suffering, money that they're owed as part of their contracts.
It may be 30 years later, but they'd like to have their back pay. As the attorney said, no pain and suffering. You can't put a price on that.
Yeah.
Just give us what you agreed to give us.
But the Pentagon and the CIA have so far refused to pay, claiming the commandos cannot prove they were employed by the United States, and besides that they filed their lawsuit too late.
They didn't get to the courthouse in time. Where were they for 20 years? Was it perhaps we left them in a prisoner of war camp?
Mattis says the Pentagon's own report for the Joint Chiefs proves the commandos were employed by the U.S., and Bill Colby said these men deserve to be paid.
If you're talking about do we owe a moral obligation to them, I'm right with you. I don't have any problem. We have not fulfilled that moral obligation.
The cost would be $11 to $12 million. And Colby said the Congress could pass a bill now authorizing payment as a way of fulfilling America's moral obligation to the commandos.
I would support paying it. You know, it's not that much money on the whole Pentagon budget, that's for sure. And it would be a matter of grace by us to do.
Why has the story never been told?
I think it was too embarrassing, to be honest, Mike. People sat on this. What happens when you throw away a whole army and then declare them all dead?